Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. My name is Georgia Haddad, and I'm a senior manager with the Partnership for Public Service. For those of you who aren't familiar with the partnership, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit working to build a better government and a stronger democracy through policy ideas to make government work better, leadership development, workforce programming, and convening conversations like this one to help support the federal workforce. Over the last few weeks, the partnership has been hosting an explainer series, many of you might have joined, to help federal employees navigate a rapidly changing environment and to provide some more tactical tips to attendees of those. And then we're also aware of the emotional toll that this environment is taking on those currently in or transitioning out of federal roles. So with that in mind, we've launched this series called the Civil Service Support Series. We've already had one, and of course this evening is a part of that to offer coaching and emotional support tools. The partnership is here to help support you as best we can, and we're trying to do a lot of resource sharing, so we'll share a lot through the chat to make sure that you're up to date on everything that we come across. We're trying to provide plain language explainers, offering leadership coaching like this, and then just continuing to do what is a hallmark of the partnership, sharing stories of the incredible work that federal employees do across the country. So thank you for your service. With that in mind, I'm going to make just a few quick housekeeping notes, and then we'll jump into this evening's conversation. So this webinar has been developed with your pre-submitted questions in mind, but you can also submit questions anonymously through the Q&A function, and we'll work to get to some of those as well. We might not be able to get all of them tonight, but know that there will be future civil service support sessions and also those explainers, so be on the lookout for additional topics if this one doesn't cover some of the things that you might be looking for. So again, at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button. You can enter things as we go, as our facilitator today, Tom Fox, is speaking, or at the end, we'll pause for questions. And then finally, while this discussion is really geared towards those who have left or are in the process of leaving federal service, it's an open forum, and we might have folks joining us from other communities. So just want to say that now. Before I hand it over to our facilitator today, Tom Fox, I'll just add that I might be popping on camera periodically to help pull forward those questions or comments from the chat. So don't be alarmed if you see me on and off screen. All right, so now I'm really happy to introduce the fantastic Tom Fox. Tom is an experienced coach who has worked with leaders at all levels, including private sector CEOs and C-suite leaders, senior level public service executives, both political and career, and social entrepreneurs in large nonprofits. Tom has spent time working across the private, nonprofit, and public sectors, and in his coaching, Tom has helped accelerate leaders' abilities to make well-informed personal and business decisions, confront conflict, and navigate change. So thank you, Tom, for joining us. I'll pass it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Georgia. I just want to echo Georgia's gratitude for everyone who's joining us tonight, first for making the time to join us, and even more importantly, for your public service. I know these are extraordinarily difficult times for many federal employees, and it's my hope that based on personal experience, my work with other leaders, public and private and not-for-profit, that there are some stories and some resources that we can share with all of you that might be of help. And as Georgia said, I've encouraged her to help me sort of monitor the chat so that as questions come up, we're able to tackle those real time. We'll reserve some time for Q&A at the end, but we don't have to wait until the end. If there's something that feels urgent or more important than whatever it is that I'm talking about at any one time, let's talk about that thing that matters most to you. So I'm going to put some slides up just as a sort of a visual reference for us so that you have an idea of what we're talking about and the resources that I'm sharing. What I will say is that in total, there are sort of six elements that I want to try and cover in the time that we have together. And I want to say something about it because when you see anything like the 6 steps to navigating your next steps, it feels a bit like clickbait, right? It feels like those articles that I think are well-intentioned, but oftentimes come across as like hacks, right? They're superficial. They seem straightforward on their presentation, but in reality, they don't get into the depth that is necessary. And the way I hope to balance that out today is by, sharing some personal and professional anecdotes from folks who've had to tackle the kinds of issues that you're tackling right now, and to share with you some resources that you could dig into further, if and when you're ready to really get to work on these sorts of things. And at the end, I'm also going to include my LinkedIn profile so that if there's any additional support I can offer anybody that's online this evening, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. That may be the easiest way just to do so. So these sort of six objectives, Georgia, did you have something to chime in with?
I did really quickly. There was just a question in the Q&A that I think is a good one who had questions about disability and medical retirement. Um, Really important questions. This session is not going to focus on those this evening, but we will share a link to our Civil Service Support Hub website so you can check on there for resources. And then also our explainers, which are very similar to these, will have very specific topics that drill down into some of the things that you're asking here, and you can search for the right kind of sessions to get you exactly the information that you need. Thanks, Tom. Sorry to
Yeah,
jump in there.
no need to apologize whatsoever. I think again, it's important that we sort of tackle these questions real time. No doubt that a lot of you are struggling with how to organize your thoughts. You may have a lot of questions and a lot of worries, and it's better to sort of get those out and put them on the table. And as Georgia suggested, between the Civil Service Support Series and the Explainer Series, there's quite a bit of resources that the partnership is providing. And there's, I think, some nice complementary overlap among them as well. So, again, as you think about sort of digging more deeply into some of these topics, you may want to go to another one of those sessions, not just for that question, but for others that may be on your mind as well. So, as I mentioned, there's sort of six steps that I want us to cover together over the course of our time this evening. I'll go through each one in turn. And like I said, I'll provide an anecdote and then some resources that you can use and dig into that I hope will be able to help you through navigating your next steps. So, first one is just making sure that you're attending to your own needs, right? Recognizing sort of where you are on any given day in any given hour and what it is that you need most in order to make some sense of forward progress. The second is to make sure that you're, sort of basing your experience in reality, that you're testing your assumptions and not sort of spinning yourself up too far into the worry that can be helpful in some regards, but also counterproductive. So we'll talk a bit about that. The third, and these are in no particular order, might say put the third one first, second, third, maybe it's underlying this whole conversation. It's this idea of making sure that you don't go alone, that you reconnect with others and you're maintaining contact with folks just so that you can provide support to one another, let alone, figure out exactly what your next steps are. We'll talk about some resources that may help you sort of develop your contingency plans. If you're worried about your federal service or have recently been separated, or maybe you're sort of caught in the tug of war between, am I in or am I out based on what the executive branch says or the courts say, this may help you sort of deal with that ambiguity or uncertainty. And then we'll talk about how you can even more concretely make forward progress. How do you do the outreach and find the opportunities that are going to hopefully both be the sorts of things that can sustain you, but also be fulfilling to you in a professional sense, which is going to be hard, right? I mean, I suspect that many, if not most, if not all of you have chosen a career in public service because it matters to you. And the question now will become, all right, well, what is it that I can look at that will be, close to, if not equally fulfilling? So with that in mind, we'll kind of go through each one. Again, feel free to post your questions. Georgia will interrupt me and make sure we're discussing what matters most. And in lieu of that, I'll continue just kind of rolling like a snowball downhill, right? So feel free to interrupt at any time. So the first item I want to talk about is this idea of performing a personal checkup. I did some work in the mental health communities a few years ago, and they would oftentimes call it a checkup from the neck up, which I thought was quite memorable. And it's this idea that, we so oftentimes tend to, whatever our physical needs are, if we are feeling poorly, we may go to the doctor, but we're not always taking account of what's happening inside of our heads, right? Which is, just as important as any other organ in our body at any time. Fortunately, there's been some progress made on that front, but especially when you're confronting any sort of significant change, it's wise to kind of keep a tune of what's happening and what you're thinking about and how you're feeling as a way of making sure that you're doing what's necessary in order to feel that sense of forward progress that is so important right now. So I'll give you one example. I'll start with a story, and it's a personal one. It's one I've shared with a lot of leaders who've been through the programs that I coach. And it actually involves a really positive development and change in our lives. So, but before I became a full-time executive coach, I was actually an executive at the Partnership for Public Service. Really helped build the organization, built all of its leadership development programs from scratch, and built the team that delivers those programs. And I love the organization, I love the work, and that's why I've come back as a coach. I left 7 years ago because my wife, who's a public servant, had a job opportunity at the US Embassy in Madrid. And as a general rule, you don't pass up opportunities to move to Madrid, Spain, right? I think that's fair to say. And I was excited about it for a few different reasons, right? One, we had always been interested in sort of living overseas, and this was an exciting opportunity to do so. Second, it would have afforded us an opportunity to travel around quite a lot across Europe and introduce and expose our kids to different people, places, and cultures. And candidly, it sort of called my bluff. I had been interested in sort of starting a career in coaching, couldn't do that while I was a full-time executive. And, moving overseas both allowed me to and sort of forced me to explore that as a career opportunity. So we were beyond fortunate. We were quite lucky. And what I found is that after moving overseas and settling in a little bit, I was candidly a bit unhappy. And it was sort of surprising. It felt ungrateful, quite honestly. And I was lucky enough to be working with a coach myself at that point. And she reminded me of a framework that I had come across in my own work and had shared with many other leaders, but I hadn't sort of taken my own medicine in that regard. And that's the work of a coach and consultant and author named William Bridges, right? So he put together this model about managing transitions. He often says that, there's the change that affects us. That's the external piece. But then there's the transition in our heads, in our hearts, in our minds that requires actively managing just as much as the external environment. And not unlike the stages of grief, you want to be attuned to what's happening so that you can make sure you're taking the right actions to provide yourself with the sort of infrastructure and support systems that you need. So she reminded me of this framework, and I sort of took my own medicine. And what I came to realize is that for all the good that the move had afforded us, frankly, I missed the work, I missed the team, I missed the pace of operations of being a busy executive. Sure, there were good things that we were entering into, but I missed what I had had. There was a loss, right, associated with that. And so I'd encourage you to think about sort of whatever it is that you're navigating or however it is that you're navigating it, that you're likely to feel sometimes maybe inexplicable or conflicting emotions at different points, right? There's going to be some number of you who were sort of forced out of your positions, right? So it's natural that you would feel badly about that. In other instances, maybe somebody took a voluntary early retirement, right? Or a voluntary separation incentive payment. So you walked into it with an intention, but you might still feel the loss associated with things. And in addition to the work that Bridges has done, I've worked with some other coaches in the partnership to kind of put together what I think is a really sort of helpful graphic to say, you do experience some sort of ending, and you may be in the midst of that right now or facing it, facing the prospect of it, depending upon your circumstances. In which case you may feel, a little numb, maybe a little shock, maybe a little confusion, maybe a little fear even at that point. And then as you enter into it a little bit further, and as the 24-hour news cycle continues to bombard you with more information, you may get to this point where you maybe even feel almost a sense of despair. But the reality is, if you can actively manage, not rush yourself through this process, you can literally and figuratively get to the other side and some of the new beginnings that may await you. But it's something you have to be attuned to and sort of actively manage. A couple of things I would note about this approach. Number one, there's no time frame associated with each one of these phases, nor is it a linear one-way direction, right? You'll experience different surges and slips at different points. And so it's all the more important to sort of keep attuned to what's going on for you at any one time so that you can be intentional about doing what's necessary to keep you balanced. And there's a session next week that I think may be a nice complement to this in terms of thinking about ways that you can continue to maintain your self-confidence, your optimistic outlook on life, even in the midst of adversity. But in the short term, I think just knowing what you're dealing with is really important. So something I'll use in leadership cohort programs, or even when I'm coaching an entire leadership team, is a state of mind exercise. So this is something that a coaching friend of mine named Alexander Caillet put together, where, either individually or amongst a team, you can ask yourself at any one point, what number and what adjective or adjectives would you assign to your state of mind at this time? Are you feeling hopeful? Are you feeling worried? Where is it that you may be on any end of the spectrum? And then again, you're not supposed to be anything in particular, but you take note of it so that you can understand what it is that you might need. Maybe you need to go for a walk outside and get some fresh air. Maybe you need to reach out to some friends to bolster your self-confidence a little bit. Or maybe you need to eat ice cream and binge Severance on Apple TV, right? It's up to you. No judgment whatsoever. I may have been binging Severance on Apple TV. So if anybody else has done that, it'd make me feel better if you've done something similar. So there's no sort of right answer. It's oftentimes highly individualized, but you first have to know what it is that you're dealing with, how you're feeling, if you are going to take a productive course of action moving forward. And I think this state of mind exercise might be a nice sort of starting point. If you wanted to dive deeper into it, you don't have to read the whole book by William Bridges. He's done a number of interviews. There's summary articles. You can probably find a summary on Wikipedia even that's probably pretty decent, just to give you a sense of what's going on for you and how you can actively manage it. But the other steps in this process, and again, they may not be sequential, offer you a nice idea of how you can actively manage your emotions and reactions to external events in the most productive way. So that's what it's sort of one step. And I'll tell you candidly, for my part, um, what I decided to do was actually a couple of things, right? One was to enjoy the Mediterranean lifestyle a little bit, right? There's a reason it's labeled that way. So, enjoying the warmth, the fresh air, and really sort of tending to my health and well-being in a way I hadn't as a very busy executive. The other was to engage in the sort of strategic planning around the type of work that I wanted to do. Who are the people that I want to work with? Who are the sorts of leaders that I want to serve? What type of work do I actually want to produce and deliver? Having the time to think again for the first time in a very long time was actually quite re-energizing as well. It wasn't always easy, right? When I would reach out to organizations and get rejected, that was one of those slips that caused me to feel a little bit more sort of worried or desperate. But over time, I was able to really zero in on the things that mattered most, pursue those best and most effectively, and put together a really nice portfolio of work that, as Georgia mentioned, not only includes a lot of work with government leaders, but also private sector executives and nonprofit executives as well. So this might be a good place to start. Just take stock of where you are, what you're feeling, and what you think you may need that is healthy and will lead you to a productive path around moving forward. Second step I would offer, and I think it's a sort of a close cousin to the first step, is this idea of reality testing your assumptions. I'll give you another story. This is courtesy of a senior executive I was coaching recently, who, in the midst of some of the large layoffs and rifts, mentioned that he had a direct report who candidly was spiraling in worry. Specifically, she had just worked very hard to gain entry into an SES candidate development program that, of course, as soon as it started, was immediately shut down. And the worry started to overtake her, right? I got in, they closed it, I won't get in again. What does this mean for my prospects for becoming an executive? you know, what am I going to do moving forward? And he did a wonderful job without any coaching from me, I might add. He might be great at coaching me, in all candor. What he said is like, look, let's get back to the facts here. The reality is you have a good job already, right? You were able to gain entry into an SES candidate development program. And once those reopen and begin working again, it's likely that you'll be able to effectively compete to get into those sorts of programs. So let's not worry about what we can't control. Let's instead focus on what's right in front of us. And I think that's good advice for anyone. I'll probably butcher the quote, but one that I love from Mark Twain that says, I've been through some terrible things in my life, some of which have actually happened, right? It's a sort of a nod to the worry that we all experience, right? It's quite literally the way our brains are developed, from the time of early humans, right? We're wired to look for risk, to worry as a way of protecting ourselves and promoting our survival, right? That's where we get things like the fight, flee, or freeze response to any sort of adversity. So we're sort of battling our human nature here, and it's a helpful defense mechanism, but it can also be counterproductive, especially if it causes us to kind of slip into that negative mindset, that negative self-talk that won't help us sort of move forward. So, the thing I'd like to offer you here as a concrete example of something you could do relative to that story I provided just a moment ago is to familiarize yourself with a model called the ladder of inference. Literally, you can see here the picture of the ladder. This is something that was developed by Chris Ardress, who was a longtime academic, and basically outlined in a professional sense what it is that we do in a biological sense, right? Which is that we tend to jump to conclusions. And you would never jump up the rungs of a ladder, right? Unless you were in Cirque du Soleil or something like that. No, you would climb up each rung independently. And so if you find yourself jumping to some conclusions, you want to climb back down a little bit and get back to the data, right? What is observable? What is real? What is tangible? And then build off of that to think about then what's possible. So it's a simple model. It's a silly model, but it's one that if you can keep it, and I like the idea of the ladder metaphor because it may be a bit more sticky. It's a way to help you think about, all right, how can I not only help others sort of climb down and focus on reality, how can I help myself do the same? So I'd encourage you to think a little bit about the ladder of inference, right? As a way of making sure that you're grounding and reality testing your assumptions before you get yourself too worked up. There'll be plenty to get worked up about in real life, but you want to make sure that you're not shadow boxing. You're fighting the fights that really need to be fought. So that's a second sort of tool, a second step that you can take in terms of thinking about how to navigate your next steps. The third thing I would say, and again, not necessarily the third thing that you do, is to really think about ensuring that you're not going alone, that you're reconnecting with family, with friends, with colleagues, maybe reaching out to new organizations and new people as a way of navigating your next steps. You really don't know what's available until you get out there. And you may have heard about this event on LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn is a great tool. I think folks have been wonderfully candid about sharing their reality, right? I've been recently let go. I've, been laid off, but you want to keep going out there, either reconnecting with old contacts, finding new ones, or using other forms of social media to connect with people that you may not otherwise be able to connect with. All right, I promised an anecdote or story in each one of these steps, and in this one, again, I'll make it a personal anecdote. Um, Shockingly enough, this is an example of where social media can be helpful. We talk often about sort of the ills of social media, and those are real, and they tend to be more significant than maybe some of the good stuff that can come from social media. But this is a good story. So, as part of my transition from working full time at the Partnership for Public Service to becoming a coach and contracting with the Partnership for Public Service, I I got out there on social media, not so much posting, right? I'm not so much active. If you've seen my LinkedIn, I maybe is not as active as I should be. Maybe this will be a catalyst for me to do so. But getting out there to connect with communities, maybe I don't have direct access to. In particular, as I began to think about coaching, I wanted to do coaching with startup organizations. My experience at the partnership, I thought, was quite akin to what executives in startups experience, right? You have a good idea, you want to do something, but you don't have nearly the time, people, and resources needed to make that idea a reality. So how can you sort of accelerate your path to success and maybe, avoid some of the common mistakes and pitfalls so that you can make your own? And in doing so, I decided to connect on social media with people who had been successful in the startup realm. The one person I'll reference in this anecdote is a fellow by the name of Alexis Ohanian. He's the co-founder of Reddit, but candidly, he's more famous by virtue of his marriage to Serena Williams, right? So if anybody knows about him, they probably know about him through marriage. Anyway, he's prolific on social media, and as I was making the transition to Spain and into full-time coaching, he had a blog post, right, where he talked about the importance of executive coaching, how an executive coach had helped him so tremendously at different points in his career, and how he had recently invested in a startup coaching company that was aiming to help other startups be better and more effective. So I use that as just a little node in my network to say, all right, let me check this company out. I hadn't heard of it before. It was in the very earliest stages of starting up. And I reached out to the company. And, candidly, it took about 2 months before I heard anything back. But it was a perfect match. And I've been working with this group. It's called Torch Leadership Labs for, well, goodness, the last 7 years. And they, to their, business model, work almost exclusively with private sector startups. They have some larger private sector organizations they work with as well, but all private sector organizations. So my government work I do through the Partnership for Public Service. My private sector work I do with Torch Leadership Labs. And I wouldn't have learned about it. Candidly, I don't know that I ever would have learned about it unless I had had that sort of very distant connection on social media with Alexis Ohanian. So as you think about your own networks, sometimes folks are natural at it, right? They don't need to be too thoughtful or too strategic about their outreach. In other instances, it can be helpful to kind of develop a plan of outreach. And I think especially if you're thinking about navigating your next steps, it may be all the more important to be really thoughtful and strategic about your approach to reaching out to folks. So, to that end, I want to share a resource with all of you. This is an older article, but I think is still very valuable and relevant one from Erminia Ibarra and Mark Hunter. Erminia Ibarra is quite prolific in terms of her research and writing and leadership and management issues. That's no disrespect to Mark Hunter. I just know that Erminia Ibarra comes up frequently in the work that I do. And she had been at NC, the both of them had been at NC. That's sort of an international business school. I think she's more located domestically these days. But they wrote this article about how leaders create and use networks. And they said you want to think about it sort of systematically, right? We all tend to think of sort of our operational networks. Those are the people that we work with or have worked with most closely day in and day out. But if you only sort of focus on that sort of circle of actors, you're missing out on a couple of other really important types of networks. The second one is personal. And maybe you've already come across this. If you work in the Washington, D.C. area or you work in a federal building in another city, you have the chance to make connections with and talk with people who are not necessarily directly in your operational network. If not, or if you wish to expand that, now would be the time to do so. I think people are interested in connecting with one another, helping one another through these tough times. And so looking to expand that personal network can be profound. But it's not just about, others who are in similar circumstances. It could be reconnecting with your alumni network. It could be reconnecting with a professional network. It could be building out your network by doing something you already love, some sort of voluntary activity, that sort of thing. In my personal network, funny enough, I don't think of it this way, and it sounds a little kind of icky to do so. But my sister is a wonderful professional, and she's helped introduce me to all sorts of different models and techniques and tools and resources and opportunities that I wouldn't have otherwise had a chance to see because she, sort of lives and works in an academic environment. Now, I don't have my sister sort of outlined on some sort of like network map like you see on this slide. That's a step too far. But I do, and she does as well. When we get into a situation, we think, you know what, we should probably reach out to one another to see how we might be able to help one another through things. That's just being a good sibling, but it's another way of sort of thinking about your network. The last one is the strategic network, right? And that's about maybe what you might sort of classically consider a sort of a mentoring relationship. It's developing a network of people who are more senior and more experienced, who might be able to help you think through how to navigate things best and most effectively. This actually is a great network to build out when you are engaged in voluntary activities. Usually if you're in an organization, there may be people who are on a board of directors, a fundraising committee, who may have an even greater reach than you have. If you're already doing something you love and you make good relationships with people who are similarly motivated, it's likely that they'll want to help you out beyond just the work that you're doing in the voluntary capacity. So it might be worth, again, taking the time to, just sort of set yourself down, either pull up a spreadsheet or grab a sheet of paper to think about, all right, how can I more systematically go through my network and think about where I have strengths, where I may have some gaps, and where I may have, some existing relationships that I might need to rekindle or strengthen in these current times. But we'll link to the article as one of the resources as we kind of wrap up for the evening. And so I just encourage you to think about doing this, but don't think about it again necessarily in an overly rigid way. It could just be getting together with friends to see a movie, grab a cup of coffee, go for a walk. Just, sort of follow the advice of that old African proverb. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. I think that's the key. You really want to reach out to folks, and whatever will be of benefit to you, it's likely that you will offer that benefit to others as well. All right, so we're cruising along. Again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. George is going to interrupt me, and I'd welcome sort of the dialogue. But in the absence of that, we'll just sort of keep rolling along. And for these last three steps, I'm going to focus on a singular book and a singular anecdote that will sort of follow through all the way to fruition. So sort of the fourth step that I've outlined is this idea of developing your contingencies, right? So again, depending upon your current circumstances, you may need to find something very quickly. I was coaching a government executive on Tuesday, and that's usually my first question. Second question. First is, how are you doing? What's going on for you? And second is, do you have your contingency plans? What's your most immediate next step if, God forbid, something bad happens? So you may have some very practical realities, right? Rent, mortgage, tuition payments, whatever the case may be. You might want to think about, all right, what do I need to do immediately? But then what else is it that I want to try and explore? And for these next few steps, starting with developing your contingency plans, I'm going to reference a book called Designing Your Life. I mentioned earlier when I moved to Spain, I was working with a coach. She referenced this book to me, and now I have used it I can't tell you how many dozens of times with other leaders who are either facing a transition not of their own choosing, or frankly, it is of their own choosing, right? They're just grown stale or frustrated or tired of their existing position. It's a wonderful framework. The two authors, Bill Burnett and Dave Evans, are professors at Stanford's design school, and they've applied the principles of design thinking to the process of, as the book suggests, designing your life, right? So, how, when you feel that sort of sense of unease, that sense of unhappiness, or that sense of frustration, might you gain a little more clarity to actually pursue what it is that you most want to do? I don't get any royalties. I don't get any kickback from Bill Burnett and Dave Evans. The book is a good one. It's the feedback I've consistently received is that for whatever reason, however they've written this book, it's one of the few books where they'll ask you a question or give you a prompt and people feel compelled to respond, right? So I'll outline the steps in their book, but it's no substitute for the actual book itself. If you're not a reader, we will link to their website. It's designingyour.life, and some of the resources that they have available, including a TED Talk that one of the authors delivered a few years ago. So you can see the chapter headings here. But in terms of thinking about your contingency plans, there's a few of them that I'm going to highlight as just a starting point. The first one is this idea of what they call building a compass. And it's really about assessing your life in its current state, but doing so with some distance, right? With some analytical capacity behind it. So one thing they offer, and this is one of the worksheets you can get online, is a dashboard, right? To think about across, at least these four different domains: your work life, sense of play, love, family, friends, those sorts of things, and then your personal health. How full or empty is your tank in each one of those domains, right? And then they ask you to think really kind of deeply about some seemingly very simple questions that I found are really hard to answer, right? And especially for those of us who are experienced professionals, because you probably haven't asked yourself these sorts of questions in a very long time. Um, what does work look like for you? Why do you work, right? Is it to earn a paycheck? Is it to gain a sense of fulfillment? Is it a bit of both? What makes work good versus bad, right? What works, what gives life meaning, right? So in the book, they give you not just these prompts, but examples of people who've gone through this process so that you get a sense of what some of the answers might look like. And ultimately, what you're trying to do is to get a sense of direction, right? Where do you sort of see yourself going moving forward? And they've got some associated tools to kind of help you clarify that in a more sort of concrete and technical sense. But first, you want to start off sort of strategically in a big picture sense. The second step is actually then mind mapping. Based on what you discovered in that first set of exercises, they encourage you to kind of do some brainstorming, albeit on paper or a whiteboard or a flip chart, whatever your writing tool may be. There are even software that will allow you to do some mind mapping. But you want to think about what it is that you're trying to achieve, the sort of the compass that's pointing north for you as an individual. And then you want to create all sorts of offshoots, right? So I mentioned that I would share one anecdote sort of throughout, and it's relevant here, especially on the mind mapping exercise. I was working with a senior executive in a large tech company, and he was frustrated with his work. He could have retired, but didn't want to, right? He saw great value in work, both in terms of the expertise that he had attained over time, but also in the skills that he could offer an organization. He had just felt constrained in his existing company, right? Had very little influence. The organization was highly bureaucratic, despite being a well-known and frequently used tech company. That's right. Bureaucracy is not exclusively the domain of federal agencies or the federal government. It exists in any large organization. If anything, in fact, I might suggest that bureaucracy in academic organizations is even more difficult to navigate than may be the case in federal agencies. Be that as it may, he was looking for something different. So we went through the first step that I mentioned previously, and then we went through this mind mapping exercise. And as the sort of instructions outline in the slide, you want to think about different aspects of work and life, and what it is that you want to try sort of exploring. And then as you go through this sort of brainstorming exercise, you want to see what you notice, what catches your attention, right? And in his instance, he went through this mind mapping exercise and he discovered three things that really provided him with something, sort of concrete to latch onto as he explored his next steps. The first is that he really wanted to be free of a large organization and all of the rules, permissions, relationships that were required in order to get anything meaningful done. The second thing, he really wanted to not only do his work, but to have influence on the broader organization, right? To have a helpful influence on what it was that his company was able to achieve. Um, and then last but not least, he really wanted to make sure that he was able to use his full experience and expertise, right? He felt as though he had been sort of like very narrowly labeled within his organization and couldn't use his full skill set. So those were sort of the three things in the mind mapping exercise that sort of caught his attention. And based on that, it was the path for developing his contingencies, right? So in the next step, they encourage you to think about, sort of three alternatives that you could outline. He ended up developing four, right? He decided he was going to look within the existing company to see if there was something that was a bit more sort of innovative and creative where he could have those things that mattered most to him. He was going to look at sort of similar roles in adjacent organizations, right? That maybe were a little more nimble, a little bit more accustomed to doing things creatively to see if that might be a better outlet. He was going to look to startup organizations, right? Where there was greater risk, but perhaps greater satisfaction. And then he was going to, and he did explore the possibility of retiring earlier than he had anticipated. He quickly knocked off that scenario because he still had kids who were going through college. He did end up in the short term taking an assignment within the company, but it proved that despite having the opportunity to have a little bit more creativity and influence, he felt like that he was sort of hitting a ceiling, right? So he ended up pursuing those other avenues. And, I'll save the sort of the ultimate outcome for this when we get to the next step. But I think, Georgia, maybe there's a question that came up that we would be wise to address.
Yeah, thank you. So firstly, something pretty general. We've gotten a few questions about whether or not these slides will be available. The slides won't be, but we'll do you one better. And the recording of this session will actually be on the website that I just put in the chat a bit ago. We'll share it again at the end, but you can review this session and any other past sessions on that website as well. Which brings me to another question. The explainer series are on there. So those have very specific topics, as I mentioned before, and there will be more in the future. We'll put out a poll at the end of this session. So if you've got specific topics that you'd love to see a full explainer series on, please enter it there. We're really trying our best to make these work for the needs of our audience. So there's a question about transitioning resume skills from federal service to private industry. Great question, something that we're definitely trying to focus on. There have already been a few resume building sessions, including one with LinkedIn, that are listed on the site I just mentioned, but there's also a session coming up on March 18th. That's next Tuesday from 5 to 6, and that's going to be focused on what recruiters and employers are looking for and how you can make yourself stand out. So we plan on having a lot of sessions that target this from a bunch of different angles, so definitely tune in for those. And again, that link is in the chat. You can sign up. If you scroll a little bit way down that page, you'll get all of our emails and our newsletters, so you won't miss anything. And just keep up with those, and you should have a few different opportunities to answer that question. Another thing, that came through, Tom, when you were talking about networking and connecting with folks. How do you suggest that somebody who's still in the process of figuring out what they want to do next and maybe doesn't have a really direct path, how can you help them draft questions or think about the kinds of things that they'd want to talk about with folks when having these initial conversations before they're really clear on what they're maybe even wanting to ask?
That's a great question. And I swear this was not scripted. Um, but it sort of aligns with the sort of the next step that I had planned to discuss, because I do think there's a few factors here that are worth sort of highlighting and thinking about, because it can be really tough to reach out to folks, especially if they're not anyone that you know particularly well. So I call it, this is not the terminology that the authors from Designing Your Life use. It's my own analogy. It's the idea of window shopping, right? Um, so there's a few, I think, issues that oftentimes will prevent people from reaching out. One, it's who to reach out to. Second, there's the fear factor of rejection. And then third, right, there's well, what is it we're going to talk about if we don't really know one another already? There's a great book. It's older, I grant you, but it's called Never Eat Alone. It's by Keith Ferrazzi. He's kind of like pitching this now as like a whole training session. He wrote the book years ago, but now has kind of brought it to life again. I think the book offers you all that you need, right, in terms of thinking about how to approach sort of building and growing your network over time. But what I'll outline here is just sort of a starting point, and it builds off both that work as well as the book Designing Your Life. And so, if you don't even know what you want yet, my advice would be to just get out there, but getting out there is just getting online and seeing what's out there, right? This is the time where, typically you might go to the best places to work if you wanted to enter into another agency. This might be a difficult time to do that. So instead of that, think of every sort of cool organization, cool company you've ever thought of, and go to their website and see what their career page looks like. See if they have any jobs that are available that sort of align to your general areas of expertise, your interests. See what the career page looks like, and determine whether it's something that you would ever even want to pursue. You could also look at Indeed. Glassdoor is a great place to look if you haven't been there before, as well as LinkedIn. So that's sort of where I would start there. But Georgia, is there a follow-up?
Yeah, just Tom, would you restate the few books that you just mentioned,
Oh,
Designing Your
sure.
Life, and was there one other?
Yeah, the other one was Never Eat Alone by Keith Ferrazzi.
Thanks.
It sounds a little it sounds a little used car salesy, but I promise you there's good stuff in there. Um, so yeah, so I would start before you even reach out to anybody. I would kind of look around, and in that process, just see what you notice. What are you getting excited about? What do you find interesting? What do you find sort of uninteresting or even distasteful? And use that as a way of forming who it is that you'd want to reach out to them and what it is that you would want to talk to them about. And my advice is always start with seeing whether someone would be willing to entertain a 15-minute conversation or answer a few questions, even on some outreach via something like LinkedIn. LinkedIn is hard in this regard because not everybody is on that site regularly, right? And so you may take something as a rejection, which is just they didn't see it, right? And so I wouldn't read into it any more than that. But now that, we're back to having events and going places, if you now have the time, I think it is a place to go out there and see what it is that people are doing, what it is that they're saying, and who's of interest. Whether it's something that the partnership hosts, or it's something from GovExec, or any of the other sort of good government organizations or professional associations that you're involved in, and just see if you can get comfortable sort of chit-chatting with and talking with others. But what Farazi says that I think is particularly important is you don't simply want to do the window shopping, you want to do your homework as well, right? So think about, who it is you'd want to talk to, why it is that you would want to talk to them, why it is they may want to talk to you, and see if you can find a natural connection that would encourage them to reach out. And candidly, I think, as tough as it may be, you might find that people are more likely to follow up with you if you talk about the difficult predicament that you're in right now. In all honesty, right? People are looking for ways to help. And if you say, I've been recently let go as a part of the, mass rifts in government, and I'm looking for my next opportunity, and for the first time in a long time, reaching out to a new set of connections. If you have 15 minutes, I'd love to pick your brain around what you do, what you find most rewarding, and to see if you have any advice or ideas of people that I might talk to. You're not asking for a job, you're just asking for a little bit of help. And it does, for many people, trigger sort of an empathetic response that will encourage them to help you out. And think of it this way, right? I don't know, if you reach out to 50 folks, right? And 60% get back to you, right? You've now expanded your network by 30 people, right? So, yes, 40% rejected you, but 60% said, we'd be happy to talk to you. Even if it's more 50-50, you've still improved the likelihood of finding an opportunity based on those new connections. So, you could do that very specifically if you have an idea of what you want to achieve, but you could just as well do that by engaging what I call window shopping, right? Just like window shopping, the analogy is, okay, you think you may need a coat. You might have some ideas of the kinds of coats that might suit your needs. You look around before you actually decide to buy. Then you try something on, and you realize this coat that you thought was going to be awesome just doesn't quite fit right or doesn't suit you. But then you find something else that you thought would never work, and it seems as though it's custom made, custom tailored to your individual and style and needs. So I think that's the biggest thing is just get out there and think about how you might even set yourself some targets. Maybe I'll reach out to one person a week or three people a week, whatever feels right, but you need to get out there. And I would try to make the asks as simple and straightforward as is possible. Like I said at the bottom here, the key is just making sure you just keep reaching out, even just reaching out to your existing network. Man, I'm so nervous about reaching out to people. They'll hopefully give you the pep talk you need to get out there. And like I said, I'll share my LinkedIn profile. If you need a pep talk, I'll send you an encouraging message, okay? You'll get through this. You've been through it before. This is a new set of challenges, but you'll get through it again. Last thing I would say, and this aligns quite nicely with the questions about resume writing. It's this idea of getting what you want and really mirroring the language and the approach that is captured in whatever sort of job announcement, vacancy announcement, job posting that you see. I have a good friend, Nancy Siegel, who is a consultant. She's a former federal HR professional and helps folks sort of find their way into federal jobs. She's particularly expert on the recruiting and hiring process, especially for the senior executive service. And she'll often say, look, recruiting and hiring is a game. And so you best know the rules of the game and follow those rules in order to not guarantee success, but improve the likelihood of success. And, you don't want to ever mislead anyone, manipulate anyone, lie on your resume, but you want to make sure you're using a language that resonates for others. So I promised you I'd give you the sort of the final anecdote for this private sector tech exec I was working with. So he ended up sort of exploring those two paths, and much like the last step, talking to folks, talking to friends of friends, and primarily pursuing that second path, looking at sort of similar roles in adjacent organizations. But whatever it was just never the right fit. Um, Either they were looking for a different type of technical expertise. He was afraid the company was just like the one he was interested in leaving, and so it didn't feel like the right fit. And we were at this for weeks, if not months. And then one day, we have our coaching call, and he said, I can't believe it, but I just took a job with an online beauty startup. And I don't know anything about beauty products. I'm convinced this thing is going to fail, but I can't remember the last time I was this excited about a job. And it's because it sort of hit those three characteristics that were most important to him. He would be the CIO, he would be mentoring a younger team, and because it was a startup, they were really sort of making up their processes as they went along. And it worked very well for about a year. And as he predicted, the organization did end up going out of business. However, he then, based on that re-energized experience, was able to find his next role and have a happier, longer term landing. So, the thing I would reinforce as you're kind of navigating these next steps as we think about that transition model from the very beginning with William Bridges, it may not always be a direct line. It most certainly will not be easy. But if you avail yourselves of these sort of three topical areas and the resources associated with them, you'll get through it. But you're going to have to rely on your friends, your colleagues, and anyone else who's willing and able to help you out. And with that, I'm sure that you will achieve success. So I know we only have a few minutes left. Georgia, I know you have a few things to say. I don't know if there are any other questions that we want to tackle. But really appreciate you all jumping online, especially in the evening, and really appreciate that you're facing some uncertainty and looking for any help. I hope this has been of help. Georgia, any other questions that have come up that we need to discuss?
We can pause for just a moment before we get to that. I'm going to launch a poll here. You should all be receiving it in just a moment. All right. We've already gotten a ton of great ideas about future sessions, but we definitely want to make sure that we give you all time to answer these questions. The first is about how you feel this webinar has been. The second is about how much you agree that you'll take this information from this webinar and apply it moving forward. And the third is asking for your input on future webinar topics. So thank you for taking a moment to do that. Tom, if you are ready to go into some of your resources
Mhm.
that I want to make sure folks have while we have time. We can jump into that in a moment. But before Tom shares some of the resources that he mentioned in this session and other things that will be helpful to you as you're going along in your journey here, I just want to thank you all to be here for being here this evening. We know that everyone's really busy and we just appreciate you taking the time to share your evening with us. So please know that we're here for you. If you have any other items that you don't think fit into that poll, but you want to add them in the chat, feel free to do that. I wanted to just say that the explainer session that I mentioned will be coming up on the 18th, and that will feature recruiters and other folks who can help you understand what other recruiters are looking for and how to stand out. It'll feature Katie Hogan from the Partnership for Public Service. That's who Tom and I are representing today. Martha Lamons, who's a director of Stanton Chase, and Larry Schlesinger, who's the founder and CEO of the Schlesinger Management Services. Our next support series, that'll be a little bit more on the topic of this conversation. That will be on March 19th, and it'll feature Mark Seton, the CEO and co-founder of The Pursuit of Happiness. And Mark will lead a session on how to navigate turmoil and protect emotional well-being. So please feel free to share either of those sessions or any of the future ones with friends or families or colleagues that are going through anything that might be relevant to these sessions and benefit from such support. There's going to be another one on March 26th. They'll just keep coming. So again, take a look at that link that I put in the chat. Let me know also if for any reason you're not seeing that chat. But that link in the chat rather, but it should be sent to everybody. I will pass it back to Tom then for those final resources, but just know that at that link you can see, again, this session, once we have it recorded online, you can find it there. Any other sessions that we've held or will hold in the future, we'll put on that site. There's FAQs there, there's blogs there, and resources as well. So with that, Tom, I will pass it back to you for a few additional resources to explain what was just put in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just wanted to make sure that there were links to the things that we talked about, right? Again, I'm not suggesting you need to follow all these, but if there's anything you wanted to dig into a little more deeply, here's a good enough place to start. And thank you for putting them in the chat, right? So as Georgia mentioned, there's the whole explainer series. So I know there were some questions that were coming up around when's the recruiter session? How do I register? That would be a great place to start, is that first link. If you're interested in learning more about that sort of transitions model from William Bridges, you can go to his website. There are a few articles there that you can look at that will give you enough to go off of without having to read a whole book. The Ladder of Inference. There are a bunch of different resources that are out there. You would have to read the book if you want Chris's original work. but I thought this was great. This is actually something that the NIH put together. So it's, from one Fed to another, right? You can look to that as a resource. They look at it within the context of some of their scientific research. The Harvard Business Review article from Erminia Ibarra about networking. I think you can access 2 or 3 articles for free on the Harvard Business Review website. You have to create an account as full disclosure, and you can only access 2 or 3 articles. Just pace it out, right? This would be a good one to check out in the time that you have available in March. The Designing Your Life worksheets, we have a link for that, all the resources from those last 3 things. And then the other thing we wanted to highlight is that if you need a coach, you need some help, you need some support, you can check out the Volunteer Coaching Collaborative, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. My handle is tfoxcoach, right? So if there's something that I can do to be of help, let me know. If you just want to connect, feel free to do that as well. As Georgia said, all of us, both who are in the partnership as well as those who are supportive of the partnership's mission to help make government more effective, we're here for you, right? We're grateful for what you are doing, for what you have done, and we want to express that gratitude by being of any help we can as you navigate your next steps. I know we're a couple of minutes over, but I wanted to thank you all. Georgia, anything else you want to say by way of wrap up?
I think that's it. Just thank you so much, Tom, and thank you everyone from your service. Have a great night. Take care of yourselves. And a lot of questions in the chat still about where to find resources. If you use the link, the first one shared in that long list, and then I shared earlier in the session, it's a really good landing space for all of our future sessions, all of our past sessions, and other things that might be helpful. Thanks again. Have a good night.